Beauty ideals or beauty standards, as they've kind of come to be known, is a society's perception of what is beautiful. And that changes over time depending on the values of the society and what's going on in history at that point. But it's essentially um, what is beautiful in a society's eyes based on what they value.
Depending on the culture that you're talking about different standards. I think in our modern world, I think there's a lot of kind of what is presented to us as beautiful, but what we all really feel maybe is beautiful. I think anybody living kind of a really purposeful life, one that's built in kindness and kind of purpose towards mankind's purpose here on the planet, I feel like is always a beautiful existence, I guess. But certainly different standards matter in different times and in different cultures.
What is beauty ideals? During the time of the first known civilizations, when people were first settling down and staying in one place together, the beauty ideal was to have full bodies, and the focus was primarily on women and their ability to give life. We know this because the art shows primarily women with fertile, reproductive, and sometimes postpartum bodies. Art becomes more important during this time because the people are starting to settle down and create. With the art they left behind, we can learn art became important to expressing their beliefs. This helps us understand their values and body image and how that changed throughout time.
During the Bronze Age, what's going on is you have a shift between or from hunter-gatherer societies to more stationary societies or agrarian societies. And so there's a need for more human labor. And so the emphasis on fertility is because of that. They're trying to grow their population so they have enough workers to man the farms and to complete all of the jobs that they need. The reproductive functions of the woman were more important than her personality or than herself. It was just, she was valued because of her function in society, and that was to produce children. Men were essentially the same. Like you're going to see really an emphasis on genitalia at that time. The body types you're seeing are really super curvy women in particular. You don't see a lot of men sculpted, but the reason the women are so voluptuous is because of that emphasis on fertility. So large hips, large stomach, large breasts. With the Minoan sculpture in particular, it also emphasizes the fashion of the time. So you have this like flounced, multi-layered skirt and a completely open-breasted bodice. The clothing emphasized what was important to the society. So because fertility and childbearing and child rearing were the main focuses, there was an emphasis on breasts. And so they were completely exposed. They were not covered at all in the Minoan period. And in the sculptures that is shown and paintings that is shown.
They've been looked at in terms of the female body and how it gives life. Tended to use different colors, like lighter paint for women, darker paint for men, to kind of separate them. So one of the things to know that they were already wanting to present male and female as different. Women become very sort of soft and curvaceous, and men tend to be very, very powerful. They tend to be in very active poses, but kind of early on in the Minoan, those things are being set up as two separate things. And that's pretty clear. And the Greeks really glorified in the beauty of kind of a well-chiseled body, this body that was active and this body that could do things like jump over a bull. So the body is meant to perform, and it's meant to be viewed and admired. One of the things that you don't see in Greek art is body variety. These representations in art, whether it's in a sculpture or it's in a fresco or it's in a vase painting, these are ideals. Often you want to look at the sculpture and understand that it's not that the Greeks actually looked that way. Like taking all the ideals, like if the body could do this, what could the body do? Ideally, how could the body perform? I think some of it has to do with their belief system. They certainly believed that gods and humans were very, very similar. The gods are very capricious. They experience envy and deceit, and they do all these kinds of things. But on the other side of that, humans all have this divine spark in them. They believe that all mortals have this divine spark. And so there is a degree to which I think they are exploring kind of the highest level of what a human could be. whether it's in the performance of a ritual or it's in an athletic sport or something like that. And then likewise, when they're doing images of their gods, they're often doing images of how close their gods are to them. So in the Parthenon, the friezes that go along the side, those are all images of Athenians. You don't put regular human people on a temple, but that was the Athenians. The Athenians put themselves on a temple with Athena. They were as important.
We can tell by unidentified people in the art from that time that the Greeks placed their importance on perfection. So their art wasn't focused on the individual, but the ideal. Their beauty ideals were focused around the appearance of an all-around healthy person. Healthy body, healthy mind, healthy relationship with and favor from the gods. The art from that time was very often depictions of the gods they worshipped. So we can tell one of the ways to uphold the societal standards was by associating beauty with praising the gods.
There is a marked shift from, nude or almost nude females to nude athletic men in the span of a couple hundred years. The purpose of the sculptures in the archaic period were grave markers, they were decoration. So it's difficult to say exactly why that shift occurred, but we do know that it happened. And we know that the emphasis was no longer placed on fertility, mainly because their societies were quite large. And artwork, religion, beauty ideals, it's all based on what a society needs at any given time. And apparently they needed young athletic men. Each city-state has different gender norms. But overall, women were subservient. They were meant to be in the household. They were specifically for childbearing and child rearing. So that didn't change. Women weren't respected members of society. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to hold office of any kind. They weren't allowed to participate in intellectual discussions. But I mean, that's kind of what you see in the archaic statues. The women are stationary, they're standing still, they're staying at home. The men are mobile, and it's a very subtle difference, but it is a major difference in that the men are the ones moving society forward and the women are not. As we go farther into the ancient Greek period and we get into classical times, you don't see women represented unless it's a goddess, really, whereas everyday men as well as gods are represented. So it's a very male-centric society. That's what they valued. And as perfect as the human body can get, that's what they want to show. And because the Greeks are all about achieving perfection, whether it be in their society, in their home. And so that's just that physical representation is, to them, a young male athlete. They prayed and they worshiped on the daily basis, but then they would come together and have these games specifically for various gods, like the ones at Olympia are for Zeus and the ones at Delphi are for Apollo. And so they'd come together and have this set of games to glorify the gods that were the most powerful in their minds. And the best way that the ancient Greeks could come up with to do that was to have a physical presentation. At the games, they would not only have physical feats. They weren't just races and wrestling and things like that. They would also have competitions for poets and playwrights to present their work. When you look at Olympia, there was a theater. When you look at Sparta, there was a theater. When you look at Delphi, there's a theater. There's all of these different theaters that are placed strategically around the site of the games. You don't ever just see a track or a gymnasium without a theater. They're always together. When you get into the classical period, you can tell that the Greeks have started to really kind of latch on to this idea of physical perfection being a manifestation of, like godliness, because they have started to use actual people as models. And their sculptures and their paintings are starting to look incredibly lifelike. But just because the Greeks were working, the artists were working from live models and not just one model. It's not like the Romans where you look at one person and that's what you sculpt. They looked at a bunch of people who were considered physically perfect and kind of made all of their sculptures a combination of those perfect. So they offer livestock and they offer, crops. And so, that's the the bread and butter of society, quite literally. Like that's what they have to survive on. So it makes sense that they're offering that to the gods. But the other thing that they offer is themselves. They offer performances, whether that be an intellectual performance like a theatrical performance, or whether that be a physical performance like a race or a wrestling match. And so they value humans, and they value what gives humans life.
The Greeks, like most cultures, kind of understood, you know, gender was more fluid, but they also understood it to be mostly in binary opposites. But that went with everything. So you were either free or you were a slave. So, you know, they're thinking in kind of two opposites across a lot of ways. Your class, your social class kind of fit into this well in terms of the way that you were categorized. So gender, again, they're often approaching gender in terms of ideals, or they're in terms of not the ideal person, but what the ideal of marriage should be. So I think in art, you often get the same kind of approach in terms of ideals. It's all kind of what this gender should be like. A lot of it is about the tasks that they're performing based on what they felt like should be masculine tasks and feminine tasks. Sometimes the nudity for men is about, they'll talk about it as heroic nudity. Like they're meant to represent the hero, and the hero as this beautiful nude figure. And a woman, you know, might be depicted more like a mother. And so the nudity there would be either limited or it would be non-existent, because she's really in her role as a mother or as a wife. And so I think the nudity can play a role into how they're depicted and what they're doing as well. Most of these civilizations, these are civilizations that are driven by men. The female role is very important, but it's important it's always viewed in terms of the continuation of the civilization, or in the case of the Greek city-states, you know, the continuation of the power of the city-state. So for a Spartan woman, producing the next Spartan warrior is one of the greatest things that she can do by women. Now, that's not to say that, especially in the upper classes, women did have certain roles. And for a young girl, you know, she could go through these different kind of rituals and things like that as she moved up. But the ultimate kind of transition in her life was at about 14 or 15, and that was to marriage. And so it still is about keeping that patriarchal structure. Often what they're doing, and I think this is where kind of like the relationship between, this is why it's so, the Greek relationship between humans and their gods is so unique. It's almost completely unique of all of these civilizations, of these Bronze Age civilizations and classical civilizations, in that while they certainly believe that the gods have immense power, they know that the gods they have faults. It's about the ideals of the heroic life, but yet it's often cast in terms of these poor decisions that they make. And the gods are often talked about in the same way. Or I can think about some of the later Greek sculptures that are actually of foreign invaders that were defeated. And so they're the enemy, so to speak, but they have this beauty of body, and they have this very sort of tragic pose, because there is an image of the barbarian or the invader. It's an image as they die, and they have this beauty of body. And so in that instance, the message is really about honoring your foe. He's been injured and he's kind of laying, and you sort of have the sense that he's almost about to kind of, you know, whatever, but he's got this gorgeous, you know, form. And so I think it does, and he's shown he was very formidable. So the fact that you defeated him makes your victory all the more very, very competitive. And the body is wrapped into that. So religion is a big part of it, because I think you really believe that about there being this spark of divinity in all humans, then the form of those humans and the things those humans would do would certainly occupy you in terms of the art you made and the art you enjoyed. And so I think a lot of it is about trying to, you know, they aren't immortal. They're mortal, and they have these very frail bodies that are not going to hold up. So to really push yourself and be the best form that you can be, especially in athletic competition, I think is about trying to reach toward that divine spark that you have inside of you. In these different rituals that took place over the course of a young man's life or a young woman's life, it was about moving them towards their destiny. And that was wrapped into what the gods wanted for them. It was wrapped into their social class. It was wrapped into their family dynamic, I suppose. But they are definitely considering, you know, what the gods want for these young people. And so to be in healthy mind and body was to help to continue to fulfill their destiny.
Rome was interesting because unlike a lot of cultures, when they took over, they didn't force any of their subordinates to adhere to any kind of religion that they were, you know, doing.
Towards the end of the Greek culture, you have what's called Hellenism, which is this kind of, they call it sort of pan-Greek culture, which is certainly, that in of itself is the mixture of a lot of cultures. And the Roman culture that developed is, again, even more of a hodgepodge. And so you have a wide variety of cultures that are mixing. And as Rome expands into this empire and brings in more groups kind of within the empire, you have an even larger sort of mixing of ideals and thought systems and all kinds of things. And a lot of these gender ideas, you know, that we still carry are very, very ancient, and they're very inscribed into the structure of government, and they're inscribed into the structure of just leadership in general. Men were almost always afforded more opportunity. Again, a woman's trajectory was limited. She had, you know, depending on her class, she might have quite a bit of opportunity to be out in public and mix with other people and do things like that. But her ultimate goal, her ultimate purpose was to be married and have children. And so I think, you know, the way that we approach the role of women now is a pretty modern idea. Some examples over the course of history where a woman is really writing her own destiny and making her own, you know, she's calling her own shots and doing her own things, but that's kind of an anomaly. That's not the standard.
We go from a polytheistic society like the Greeks had and the Romans adopted, and then in about 300 CE, Emperor Constantine switches the Roman Empire to Christianity, and you go to a monotheistic society. So automatically right there, everything changes. It's about being good and being moral so you can get to that better place. There's no more of like the overt sexuality. There's no more of the bettering your body for the sake of the gods. It's all about reserving yourself and saving yourself and making sure that you're making the right choices. So it's completely different. There are no exposed bodies. There's no nudity in artwork anymore. You can't tell what shape the human is underneath the clothing that's represented in the artwork. And your purpose is not to better yourself. Your purpose is to better yourself for the glory of God. So it's all about, you know, moving past humanity and moving on from the life you're given and getting to that next stage and bringing as many people with you along the way as you possibly can. So their body and their image didn't matter. So they didn't show it. The Greeks in particular latched onto Christianity aggressively. And I think a lot of that had to do with they were looking for a single savior. There's this emphasis on forgiveness and love, which is different. And I think the Greeks really needed that because they didn't have control over their lands or their people for, you know, a couple thousand years.
You do have this culture that's in decline and then this culture that's expanding. And because on the eastern side, you have, you know, this continued connection to trade and things like that. You've got a very, very wealthy side. The way the body is depicted pushes this message, not so much about beauty, but about age and wisdom. When it's an image of propaganda, then it definitely still sticks with this idealism.
So beauty ideals are all about communicating what a society values and displaying what a society needs at any given time. So, you know, the beauty, it's ideal, right? What is the perfect version of a human being that this society wants at at this particular time. And that could reflect, fertility and the need for fertility. That could talk about wealth, that could talk about hunger, that could talk about inclusivity. It just totally depends on what that society values. And that can be taken to the extreme. I mean, with the Greeks, it was all about athleticism and youth, and knowledge, and making sure your body and your mind are healthy. But then when you get into modern history, you have this sense of perfection that happens with the Nazi regime, and you get eugenics, and they're trying to manipulate human genetics to create the perfect person. So anytime there's an emphasis on perfection and there's only one type of perfect being, that's not possible for everybody to adhere to that. When you add in factors, just speaking specifically about what the human body looks like, when you add in factors of genetics and race and ethnicity, and then you get body types and, medical conditions, things that wouldn't allow you to look like that perfect version. I think our society now is doing a much better job of combating that and making sure that there are multiple different types of ideal, and multiple different versions, and kind of, making sure that the narrative says that your ideal is what you deem your ideal to be, that it doesn't really exist anymore. So, but it's been a long time coming for that to happen. And it's something that we have to actively work towards. It's not something that we can just kind of let happen, because if you do try and let it happen, the people that feel strongly about one particular type are going to be the loudest ones. Art is constantly shifting and changing. What we define as art is not always like what most people would define as art. And there's so many different forms, but essentially art will always exist because it's always an expression of what a human values. And whether that's an individual person or a society, that's not going away.
It helps us understand kind of how they value their appearance. And it might help us understand in some of the crazier things we do for our appearance, understand what it is we're trying to communicate and what it is we're trying to do. We're still trying to learn about ways to communicate with one another through our bodies, through our accessories. We're still trying to communicate, you know what I mean? So that's why I think those beauty standards are important to learn about, because you're still trying to dig into who these people were and what they were trying to say with the way they wore their hair and the way that they wrote philosophy and the way that they built temples and the way they did kind of anything. So for me, they'll sort of always be of importance, even if it's kind of a silly detail. It'll always be really important. I think especially too, the more you understand about other cultures, whether contemporary cultures to yourself or previous cultures, I think you get this sense that, I mean, humans, we're so, gosh, we make so many mistakes and we're so fallible, but we try so hard and we want to be beautiful. We want to be connected to divinity. We want to believe in powerful things. As soon as you say, I understand what this life involves and I understand everything there is to know in this life, that's the worst position you could be in. The best position to be in is to say, I know nothing and I'm going to go somewhere and find out more. And I'm going to listen to this group. I'm going to listen to this group. I'm going to see what these people do. I'm going to look at this, and it's going to help me understand this thing we call the human condition. And I think that's the most important, one of the most important things we can do. And then to act on all of that with kindness. I think that's the best thing we can do with our life.
As time changes, a society is going to value different things. And now it's more about athleticism and health than it is so much about like constructing the perfect body. So we're using a lot of athletes again as models because it's all about taking care of yourself. You don't want to make the entire society feel like they're different. Now we're in a really awesome place in that magazines and fashion are not just stuck on one body type, but they're embracing a lot of different body types. It's all about communicating what a society values, and right now our society values
inclusivity. That means that Mediterranean used to be an ancient lake. In solid parts, a continent used to link Greece to Turkey, all is solid, and Africa, all one solid block. The name of this continent was Aegeis or Aegeis. After terrible earthquakes and tectonic movements, this continent sank. The tops of the mountains became the islands, rocky and waterless. Only 1,600 are inhabited, the others are just rocks. On the other hand, Africa has been disconnected from Europe, forming in between the island of Cyprus and the island of Crete. Okay? And the water of this lake moved on the other side of forming the circle, creating the Ionian Sea. And on that part, peninsulas have been disconnected, they became also islands. So you see the islands of the Aegean Sea that used to be the tops of mountains, rocky and waterless, and we see the islands of the Aegean Sea that are ends and disconnections of peninsulas, green, like Ithaca, like Cephalonia, like Corfu, green islands. So the parts of the sea that separates Greece from Turkey nowadays, don't forget Turkey, 1453, is the Aegean Sea. The part that connects Europe to Italy on the other side is the Ionian Sea, is the Mediterranean Sea, the whole thing. Notice how all these formations after earthquakes change the environment. So it's rocky, the area we just passed, and in a minute you'll see, it's around the corner, sandy, just sand. So usually the father scuba dives to the right and the mother with the child swim here to the left. And all along you see small shrines. You notice this, that traveling in Greece we see small shrines. I'll show you because we see several. And these are ex-votos of people that have survived through a car accident. Survivors. Very, very few are memorials. In the case of memorials, the picture of the killed, of the deceased is placed there. In both cases, the small shrines that sometimes are elaborated, sometimes are very simple.